Welcome, Fabrice.
Thank you.
Wait.
Hi, Loic.
Yeah.
So basically, for the past 13 years, the basis of my professional success, both as an entrepreneur and as an angel investor, has really been taking ideas from one country and executing them in another country. So I started by taking auctions and the concept of eBay and bringing that from the US to Europe, and specifically to France. And my first real hit was actually taking an idea from Europe and bringing it to the US with mobile media. But over the past 4 to 5 to 6 years, most of my successes have actually come from both investing and executing or operating in Brazil and Russia. And so what I want to talk to you about today is pretty much everything I've learned as an angel investor in general, and specifically as it relates to Brazil and Russia, because I can tell you I've made every mistake there is to make. And I'll actually go through all of those mistakes and so that hopefully you want to actually be copying them. But before I talk about the mistakes I've made in angel investing, I want to talk to you a little bit about why Brazil, why Russia. Because the reality is, when you think about Brazil, you think of Giselle, you think of the soccer team, you think of Rio or Favelas. You don't necessarily think about the internet. And this is not what I think, this is what we think, because these images come from Google Images. I just went Google Images, I typed Brazil, and this is what came up. But the reality is, Brazil is not just this. It's also an entire ecosystem of very successful internet companies, many of which have gone public or have tens or hundreds of millions in revenues. And it's actually created a real business there with thousands of little startups below this ecosystem. So Mercado Libre, which is the eBay of Latin America, is publicly traded, worth a few billion. You have Submarino, which is the Amazon of Brazil, and many others that have actually done really well. And the reason this has been true is Brazil is actually a large country, population of about 200 million, and has been growing really fast. On a PPP basis, it's the 8th richest country in the world, and has been growing 7.5% in 2010. And it's also, more importantly, the largest e-commerce market in Latin America. It's a $10 billion e-commerce market, growing 40% a year. It's actually bigger from an e-commerce perspective than pretty much all of the other Latin American markets combined. Now, Russia, same thing. If I type Russia in Google, what comes up is like Putin, some oligarchs, Siberia, some oil. But Russia is also an amazing internet economy. There are two very well-known publicly traded companies, which are Yandex and Mail.ru, worth many, many billions. And below that, there's actually an entire ecosystem of very successful companies. I mean, from Zeptolab, which makes the very successful Cut the Rope game, Parallels, and many others. And same thing, Russia, not only is it the largest country in the world, it's a population of about 140 million people. It's actually already the largest internet population in Europe, with 60 million users. And it's actually, when you look at both Russia and Brazil today, are reasonably similarly sized. There's 70 million internet users in Brazil, 60 million in Russia. And Russia is also about a $10 billion e-commerce market. And it's growing about 25% a year. So there are real companies there. And the reason there was an opportunity for someone like me, who I'm French and I live in New York, to be able to invest in places like Brazil and Russia, is that actually no one was doing it. And the reason no one was doing it is, despite the fact that people are saying, the world is flat, the world is globalizing, the reality is the world is much less global than you think. The world, globalization is far less entrenched than you think. Only 2% of people go to college in a country outside of the country in which they were born. Only 3% of people live in a country other than the country in which they were born. And if you look at venture capital, only 20% of venture capital is deployed cross-border. And that includes places like Europe, where it's arguably a bit higher than that. And the same is true on almost every single metric. By the way, in some cases, it's actually less globalized or harder to be global today than it was 150 years ago. Right now, $85 billion is spent every year in visa processing fees. 150 years ago, things like visas, passports didn't actually exist. And so we have many barriers to trade. And that means that to the extent that you're willing to be global and travel, you have opportunities to invest on a cross-border level. Now, the problem is, when you start investing, you make a lot of mistakes. And I've made every mistake there is to make. So when I started investing, after I sold my last company, Zingy, for about 80 million, so I made a fair amount of money, I thought, I guess with success breeds hubris. I thought, oh, everything I was going to touch was going to turn into gold. And the reality was, unfortunately, quite different. The first 6 investments I made all failed. So I lost $6 million, which at the time represented about 25% of my wealth. 6 companies, 6 million, boom, 1 to 0. And so I want to share a bit about all the mistakes I made, both strategically in general when it comes to angel investing, and also specifically tactically when it comes to angel investing in Brazil and Russia. So first, tactically, if you're going to fund a young 22-year-old entrepreneur in the US who's going to do something in e-commerce, it's actually very reasonable. In the US, if you want to launch an e-commerce site, it's reasonably easy. The suppliers are going to give you an XML feed, and you're going to have all of their inventory in real time through XML. They're willing to do consignment or drop shipping, so you don't need to take any inventory, so it doesn't take that much capital. You have great companies that are willing to reship the products for you, so you don't really need to take care of the logistics. The payments work very well, so all you need to do as the entrepreneur is really think through the product, think through the sourcing and the merchandising and the marketing, and you're in business. And then, especially in e-commerce, it's kind of a spreadsheet game. Is your customer acquisition cost lower than the long-term value of the customer? Boom. The reality is, if you go to a place like Russia, none of this is true. The suppliers have no idea what they have. They don't have an XML feed. They ship it to you, and you basically open the box, and you discover, ooh, there's stuff there. And then you have to manually go through it. And then you want to deliver it, and there's no real shipping opportunity. And then to get paid, it's cash on delivery. And so all of a sudden you realize that if you sell something, maybe that the supplier thought they had, they might not have it, and so you only have a 50% conversion rate, and so you need to have inventory. So boom, all different ballgame. More capital intensive, you need inventory. And then you deliver products, and so you hire a courier service, and you realize that the couriers are stealing the products. Or maybe they're stealing the products, and they go to the door of the customer, and they take the cash, and they steal the cash and the product. So you're like, okay, now we need to have a nice white glove service. I'm going to build my own internal courier service. So you build the courier service, and yes, it's great quality. The products are not stolen because you're paying the couriers a very high price, but they're only delivering 2 packages a day. And you're like, why are they delivering 2 packages a day? I mean, granted, Moscow is very big, and granted, there's a lot of traffic, but it still is pretty weird. And then the CEO of that company, that's actually a friend of ours, had an insight. He's like, ooh, let me remove the passenger seats out of the delivery vehicle, and all of a sudden, the deliveries went from 2 a day to 5 a day. So basically, these courier people were actually playing taxi. But they're gaining whatever. They're making $40 a dollar playing taxi, and you have like $20,000 of merchandise in the back. You really don't want that to happen. But then he had another insight. Oh, why don't I put like really spiky things where the seat used to be? And lo and behold, productivity doubled, and now they started doing 10 deliveries a day. And so if you make it impossible for them to play taxi, you actually have a reasonably effective workforce. Now, this is one anecdote amongst many, but you can actually make it work. It's just understanding the local nuances and news. Now, in Brazil, it's slightly different. Logistics work, payments work. But, for instance, you're going to get sued all the time. It's an extremely litigious society, and you get sued for really inane reasons. Oh, I didn't like the site. I had a negative user experience. You need to pay me $500. And I know a number of CEOs who were operating sites with a lot of traffic in Brazil, who had reasonable revenues in Brazil, and they were getting sued, but they were not in Brazil. They didn't have a company in Brazil, so they didn't really pay attention to it. And the case went in front of some mid-level judge in the middle of nowhere, and they weren't there because they didn't think they needed to be there. And the judge decided, oh, this company, they have money, the poor user was defrauded, and they took the domain away. And overnight, the business disappeared. Now, these are obviously anecdotes that show there are a few or a number of nuances in terms of how you execute in these countries. But the good news is, both in Russia and in Brazil, foreigners can succeed. You're allowed to operate, you're allowed to invest, you're allowed to exit the companies, and you can make a fair amount of money if you do it right. Now, the question is, how do you do it right? And so when I started, as I was describing, I invested in 6 companies, 6 million, they all failed. Clearly, I was doing it wrong. At least it was a good wake-up call in terms of realizing or remembering that the way you succeed in both as an entrepreneur, as an angel investor, is through iteration. You keep trying new concepts until you find something that works. And so the model that we were using actually changed. So at first, as you can see behind, I made very few large investments. And then over time, realized that this actually was the wrong model. In fact, the more investments you have, the more likely you're to be successful. So it went from basically 7 investments in 08 to 9 investments in 09 to 24, 25 investments in 2010 to 35 investments this year. And the more investments I've made, the more successful I've become. And it's not just because through diversity you get lucky. There's actually a method. Not only did I increase the number of investments I made, actually changed the method in terms of narrowing down specifically how we invest or how we select the projects we invest in. So it's as much about what we don't do as it is about what we do. So this feels like spray and pray, which is every project we see, we invest in. But the reality is we invest in about 1 in 20 projects that comes our way. So until now, I've been saying I. But the reality is neither as an entrepreneur nor as an angel investor has been I. As an entrepreneur, I have a fantastic partner whose name is Alec Oxenford, who's co-CEO of OLX, whom I couldn't operate without. And as an angel investor, I've been working with a fantastic guy called José Marín, who's been one of our partners at Deremate, which is an eBay of Latin America we helped create now 12 years ago. And we basically do all of our investments together. So from sourcing to, he's an amazing thought partner, he helps in the execution, et cetera. And so we don't have a formal fund per se, we invest directly in our own name or through our vehicles, but we always work together. Now the way we work, and as I was saying before, it's as much about what we don't do as it is about what we do. So what we do is we only invest in consumer-facing companies. Now the reality is, I've been a consumer-facing internet CEO for the last 13 years. I understand consumer-facing companies. And given that angel investing is my nighttime job, it's something I do 5 hours a week, I don't have time to do due diligence. I don't have time to understand in B2B where the sales cycles would be, where the margins would be, and who the competitors are. So only do things that basically you can intuitively get. And if you're an internet consumer-facing CEO, you look in consumer-facing projects. If you want to understand the business, go on Google, play with it, see who the competitors are. The second thing is, from a geographic focus, we're only going to invest in projects that are innovative in the US market. It's not that good ideas don't come in the rest of the world, they do, but the markets are not as big. And so if the market is not as big, to the extent the idea is not as successful as it might otherwise be, it's most likely going to fail. Whereas in the US, if you have an idea that ends up not doing too well, the market is so big, you're probably still going to do well. So about 25% of our investments are in the US. 75% of our investments are in the rest of the world. But in the rest of the world, it's defined 2 ways. One is it's really only big markets. And so most of our 75% of investments are in Brazil, Russia, and Germany. And then to a lesser extent, a little bit of Turkey, a little bit of China, and the UK. And in the rest of the world, we only invest in copies of established US ideas or established ideas. And established for us means the original model as 100 million in revenues, is profitable, or as a clear chance of profitability based on its gross and net margins. So again, it's a very well-defined box. Every week, I get 20 to 30 new deals to look at, and the reality is 20 of them don't fall in the box. And we're going to meet maybe 5 of those 10 remaining, and then we're going to invest in 1 every other week or so. Now, the way we look at angel investing is it really falls into 3 buckets. For up to 30 deals a year, we're going to be passive angel investors. Other early-stage funds in Brazil, in Russia, in Europe are going to basically send us the project, and they say, hey, we have this fantastic project. We're missing 50K or 100K. Why don't you participate with us? Up to 4 deals a year, we're actually the ones leading the project. So the entrepreneurs come to us and say, look, we need a little bit of help. We need advice in terms of logistics and payments or sourcing. We need help hiring the right people, and we need help raising the money. And there we're going to bridge the entrepreneur. We're going to help them raise the funds. And we have our own angel list of 200 angels, more or less. And we're going to basically distribute the project to our friends and see if we can complete the round, which also helps doing crowdsourcing the due diligence, figuring out whether this is a good idea. And then the third bucket, which is less angel investing, is really company creation. It's actually Jose and Carlos's main job, and they have a company called IG Expansion. And every year, they create, with me, 1 company in Brazil, basically, where we take 1 concept, which we initiate. And so it's our idea, but we find a fantastic team, and we give them 20 to 30% of the company, the first 3, 4, 5 million of funding, and they go with it. And basically one company a year, we initiate that way. So last year, we helped create an Expedia in Brazil called Viajanet, which is, in its second year of operation, is going to do over 100 million in bookings this year. And it's done very well. And a few months ago, my brother Olivier became CEO of Shoes for You, which is basically a shoe dazzle, which is a shoe subscription product for Brazil, which just launched and is looking as though they might do very well. So there are a number of investments that we've done that you can see. Now, the way we decide whether to invest or not is basically 1R. We meet the entrepreneur. Do we like the team? Do we like the pitch? Meaning, does the pitch meet the 9 business selection criteria that we evaluated? Do we like the deal terms? And do we like the product? So we expect the product to be live because in this day and age, getting a site up and running is actually rather easy. If for the first $30,000 of seed or love money they've gotten from friends and family, if you haven't been able to convince your friends and or some programmers to work for you to get it done, it's really a bad sign about your ability to execute with a low budget and about your ability to convince other people that the idea is good. I won't bore you with the 9 business selection criteria because I actually covered them at the last LeWeb Fireside Chat ad with Loic in 2009. So you can either find it on my blog or you can search for 9 business selection criteria on the blog or see the video on YouTube. But basically every idea we look at, we filter it through these selection criteria, and to the extent that it matches them, we're going to do them. So what have we learned? So we've learned that the quality of the time you spend with the entrepreneur is more important than the quantity of the time. We've invested in 90 companies. So to the extent you've invested in 90 companies, you're not going to be on the board of them. In fact, we're not on the board of any of them. Because what matters more is if the entrepreneur has questions for us, that we answer the questions rapidly. They want maybe feedback on a term sheet or an introduction to VC or feedback on the product. And we promise to be reactive on questions you have for us. But it doesn't make sense to be an administrative overhead for you. Second one is we need to stick to our investment principles. I said we're only going to do consumer-facing, only travel, user-generated content, e-commerce, or marketplaces. Several times in the past, we've had entrepreneurs that were fantastic, that had a great idea, and it didn't quite be, maybe the market was too small, or maybe it was an industry I didn't understand, but we had, I fell in love. And every time we fell in love and invested, we ended up failing. And so it's actually good to be disciplined. Diversity is good for the same reason, meaning the more deals you have, the more money you make. There's a bunch of Harvard Business Review cases on the topic that shows that if you have less than 10 investments, you lose money. If you have more than 10 investments, you make money. And the reality is things take time. In 2000, I invested in 7 startups. And if you'd asked me in 2001 how many of them would be successful, how much they were worth, I would have probably told you 0. And 6, 7, or 8 years later, one of them went public. Many of them sold 5 to 20x. But given that VCs have a 5-year time horizon, if you're an angel, it's going to take 6, 7, or 8 years very often. So you need to be extraordinarily patient. In other words, only invest the money that you can afford to lose, because chances is you're going to lose it, actually. And the last one, actually, is really important, mostly for entrepreneurs. If you're a first-time entrepreneur and you haven't made money before, you need to realize that most exits are below 30 million. And that means that you should not raise too much money at too high a price, because you're going to price yourself out of exits. So for your first startup, you're sometimes much better off raising 2 million at 4 pre than 5 million at 10 pre, because if you sell the company for 10 million and you raise 2 at 4, everyone's happy. Your investors are happy, you're happy, you have some money in the bank, and you're going to be able, for your next startup, not only to have the seed capital yourself, but to raise more money and to go big. If you raise 5 on 10 and you sell for 10 with a liquidation preference, et cetera, your investors are not happy, you're not going to make any money. So it's very important for people to focus more on not pricing themselves out of exit in the first company than it is to try to figure to go big. Which I'm not saying don't have ambition, quite the contrary. Especially in your second company, go big. Raise as much as you can at the highest valuation possible and try to build a multi-billion-dollar company. But in your first company, it might make sense to actually be cognizant of the fact that most deals fail. Now, all this is only interesting to the extent it means something. So I've invested in 90 companies. I've deployed a total of 11 million. As I said at the beginning, I've had 6 failures, but we also had 11 successes since then. And so 17 exits. There's 73 companies left in the portfolio. The 11 companies have returned 9 million. So I'm down 2 million, but I still have 73 in the portfolio. So the strategy is actually looking pretty good. And actually, if you look at Jose's performance, it's actually even much better than that, because he didn't start with a 0 and 6 the way I did. And so, that's basically it. So if you want to reach out to me, I'm available on Twitter and Facebook. If you have questions or business plans you want to send us, just email them to me, and that's it.
Timing. What a timing. Yeah. Right on time, perfect.
Exactly.
At the second. Thank you, Fabrice.
Thank you, Loic.
So glad to have you back here.
Likewise.
Thank you very much.